invitation to Beijing open and trying to work on common concerns such as climate, et cetera, then presumably mission accomplished, I suppose. I don't think this framework has a huge chance of becoming being accomplished. I think it's going to run up against some. It already is running up against some strong realities in the Asia Pacific. One of which, of course, is the fact that it contains no viable concrete strategy for engaging China in a meaningful way, with certain specific objectives in mind other than shaping and deterring. There are very few, if any, definitions of what middle grounds might look like in dealing with China in a variety of different functional policy areas. There's just a lot of grand statements being made and a desire to avoid a Cold War, much less conflict. But there's not much really there that I would regard as a strategy that reflects the complexity of China's role in Asia and the uncertainties of other countries in the region, uncertainties about China and uncertainties about the United States, and hence a common concern about the direction of Sino-US rivalry and the way in which both countries seem to be doubling down on deterrence-based signals of resolve against each other across a host of issues, from Taiwan to norms to resources, economic growth, etc., with little in the way of a middle ground or a meaningful dialogue to try and define that middle ground. That is almost, undetectable in the current U.S. strategy today. Let me just end by saying, the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific is really kind of an anomaly. The Indo-Pacific really doesn't exist as a coherent, integrated region per se. It was largely developed, I think, by the United States as a way of bringing India into the counter-China coalition with it in dealing with China across that whole range that stretches all the way from Hawaii to the Middle East. And of course, it does cover the strategic lines of communication for many of these countries coming from the Middle East and energy sources. So it's important in that respect. But as a coherent, interactive, coordinated kind of region, it really doesn't have much in the way of a real reality behind it. Yet the U.S. Insists on using this term, and I guess it's pulled most of its allies into line in doing the same thing. So I'm not a huge fan of the U.S. perspective on Asia today. I think it falls short in a lot of ways. I think it's good in recognizing the need for the United States to improve its presence in the region, but in a meaningful way, in a realistic way, in a way that is congruent with its own resources and limitations as well as its strength. That kind of complexity, that kind of nuance, you simply don't see in U.S. strategy much today. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael. And you raised the issue of the Indo-Pacific terminology. So let me actually turn to Henry right now, because the United States, Japan, Australia, the European Union, and individual EU member states, ASEAN has its own outlook on the Indo-Pacific. All of these entities or countries have incorporated into their discourse the Indo-Pacific framing. Can you explain to us and to this Canadian audience, and Canada is set to release its own Indo-Pacific strategy in the coming weeks, can you explain to us why China does not appreciate this framing, specifically of this Indo-Pacific terminology?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think I agree quite what Michael has been saying. We are probably driven too much by the geopolitical the agenda, and then we are not really looking at the reality and what are the right fitness for group everybody together. I would think, we used to have Asia Pacific, which I think had over 20 some kind of a summit and is doing a lot of good stuff. APEC summit, a lot of promoting the free trade, and then we end up with CPTPP, which I think is one of the it's also originated quite a bit of this Asia Pacific framework, and Canada is part of that. So I would really think that we should continue that. That is very mature. That is already fine-tuned by the U.S. took over, and then have high standards of a free trade agreement. Now UK wants to join that, and South Korea wants to join that, and a few other ASEAN countries. So I think why not we make all those economic framework more relevant, rather than we really put up like IPAF we talk about. I mean, and they also with the purpose to exclude China. I mean, I found it's also silly that China now is the second largest economy in the world, and probably the largest in East Asia. So we somehow we are in the 21st century. Economics so much intertwined, and China is also a big market, and so we see that China will continue to seek its modernization with the new 20th Party Congress, which stipulated that another objective in the long range. So I think we probably should really be more focused on economic alliance, which I think is there's a paradigm difference that I think U.S. now, probably starting from Biden administration, Trump administration, they focus more now on the NATO, on the Five Eyes, on the Quad, and on the AUKUS, now on APEC. It's all really have a geopolitical agenda, I'm afraid. But look, China is really pushing forward for RCEP, now the largest free trade agreement in this region. I think we should also promote this CPTPP. China is very much interested to join, and the DIPA, which is also proposed by New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile on this digital partnership. China is also officially wants to join that, and both companies set aside working group study to join this DIPA, and also of course China-Africa Cooperation. On top of that, you have a Belt and Road, even though it's not perfect, but still economic alliance. So why can't we use more economic alliance, and also for Asia Pacific, including do more business with Canada, and rather than we are really focused too much on the geopolitical thing. So probably my idea is that we should really seek more balanced, inclusive, globalization, even regional organization. Also like WTO, like Ottawa a few years ago hosted the WTO 20 countries meetings. I mean, that kind of role I think Canada can continue to play, and I think we should really save multilateralism, WTO, CPTPP, and also of course RCEP, and we can invite Canada, US to join. And if IPAF, it's really going to work, why not let China be part of that? Let's really work on economic terms that whatever US and countries like to talk about, China is open to all the topics, SOE reform and all those subsidies issues and all the rest. So I think let's have an open attitude towards the economic framework rather than we focus on geopolitical framework. So that probably the right way to go, because we're already facing high inflation, recession, pandemic, Ukraine-Russian war, and we can't afford energy crisis. We have to work together now, put our act together to really save the global economy. That's my point. Thank you.
Well, got you. Can I ask you to unpack that, though, a little bit more, Henry? Because, obviously there's a very strong geopolitical and security dimension to the Indo-Pacific framing, but the U.S. does have its Indo-Pacific economic framework, irrespective of some of its shortcomings. And, the security dimension is only one point of several different pillars of the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. So why not try to engage with these Western efforts at shaping regional order and try to find an inclusive economic framework rooted within the Indo-Pacific framing? Is there an issue with that? Does Beijing see an issue with that fundamentally?
Oh, I think Beijing is always open. Like when in the early days when U.S. started this TPP, that excluded China. China is willing to join that. That China don't think this is really cannot be overcome, and China is really making all the efforts to join. And so if IPAF is really for the economic purpose, I think probably good for China to be part of that. And let's talk about it. Let's invite everybody to table and negotiate. Rather than, we set a group of countries and that excludes some other countries. China is willing to accommodate everybody. Even the RCEP, China is willing to talk with India, and which India does not want to be part of that. But I think, after all, we live in a more liberalized, 21st century now. We are not really in the old days. So I think it's really important that all the countries in the region, including Canada and China, which has millions of diaspora in each other countries to work together to really promoting the Australia, New Zealand, all those countries. ASEAN is the largest trading partner. So I think IPEF could work if they invite China to the table, and let's talk about that. And China actually is open for that. Even China's BRI is open to the B3W, EU Global Gateway, and all those schemes. So let's have an open economic framework rather than a closed, exclusively of other countries. So that's my my further explanation.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. Elina, let me bring you into the conversation now because ASEAN has its own distinct outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So I'm wondering if you can outline for this audience right here in what respects it differs from the American or the Japanese or the Australian conceptions of the Indo-Pacific, and more importantly, can it make a difference in terms of shaping regional order, right? I mean, ASEAN can scream about ASEAN centrality until it's blue in the face, but is ASEAN actually going to be a rule maker rather than a rule taker as a result of its distinct view on the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, well, ASEAN, as you pointed out, has been, I think, a really good rule taker. And the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is really a reaction to what was going on with the presentation of this Indo-Pacific concept that the US proposed. So in a sense, it didn't anticipate the Indo-Pacific coming into fruition, but it was a reaction to it. And I think the short document that ASEAN produced both acknowledged the term Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. Unfortunately, events have surpassed us in ASEAN, and so right now it's just the acceptance of the term Indo-Pacific, but still ASEAN is grappling with how to conceive of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic notion that will work for ASEAN itself. And this continues to be the case, partly because of what you brought up. There are the twin concepts of ASEAN centrality as well as ASEAN unity. And without ASEAN unity on a number of issues, including strategic ones, including geopolitical ones, there cannot be ASEAN centrality. And within Southeast Asia, we constantly wring our hands in anxiety and concern about where ASEAN fits into this geopolitical puzzle, particularly now with intensifying competition between the US and China. And we still haven't found the answer, unfortunately, because things continue to move even as we grapple with this question of how ASEAN should fit into the larger geopolitical landscape. Henry mentioned economic frameworks. I mean, I think ASEAN has been using that as a very convenient and practical tool for cooperation, for collaboration, for greater integration amongst its members, but also with its dialogue partners. The complication now is that economics has been weaponized in a way. I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, but economics is no longer just economics, trade, and commerce. And we've seen this with the IPEF, for example, and the connection of IPEF with other strategic initiatives that the US has proposed. And the linking of, for example, export controls with trade, with strategic controls even, and even in the digital space. And so now we have a series of dots that are going to be linked up together, particularly to advance a notion of the world that certain countries feel should be prevalent and dominant, in fact. And for ASEAN, the challenge really is to put itself at the table, not just to be a part of the conversation, but actually to participate and even help shape that conversation. And unfortunately, that leadership in ASEAN is missing right now. And we continue to try to unpack what unity and centrality mean for us in the region without really having a forward vision of how we see ourselves in this larger chess game between the major powers.
Thanks very much. We'll have a panel a little bit later today to unpack Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy in greater depth, but let me just turn to Kai, and for the benefit of some of the panelists here who are not Canadian, I'm wondering, in your view, is Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy likely to be significantly noticed in the region? And is Canada, as a result, likely to be considered a more serious player in that region in the years ahead?
Thanks, Zachary. It's nice to be here. You know, I'll follow with what Elina said. Elina mentioned that the ASEAN is struggling to find a place in this greater struggle between an emerging China and the United States. And I think for Canada, that's very much the same as well. Canada is on the periphery of this. Canada's looking for a place in this game. I mean, everybody, I think, recognizes the imperative of diversification. right? Everyone recognizes the gravitational pull of Asia. But Canada is 25 years past the apex of its engagement in Asia. So I think regardless of what the terminology is, there are important practical decisions to be made from a Canadian perspective on how to handle important trade-offs, right? How do you divert resources to a region that that has not been the central focus of foreign policy for really any of Canada's history? So, there are challenges on the ground as well. Canada has an immense amount of capacity building to do, both domestically and in the region, for it to become a significant player. I'll end there for now.
Thanks very much. And let me turn back to Michael. Michael, Parag Khanna and many others have written about how Asia has, perhaps with the exception of the Mongol period, always been multipolar. And to a certain extent today, especially in an era of nuclear weapons, it remains to an extent multipolar. So I'm wondering in that sense, how central is Sino-American competition actually to regional dynamics? And is there a significant potential for other actors to act as a brake on Sino-American competition shaping the region as a whole?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that the region is, of course, multipolar in some very significant ways. It certainly has many major actors who exert real influence across the region in the economic realm and in the cultural realm and in the political realm. So you can't say there's one coherent integrated region. Pardon me. And then, but at the same time, you have to deal with the reality that there are two major powers within that region. China and the United States. And they have by far the greatest amount of economic power, the greatest amount of military power, and I dare say the greatest amount of influence as a result than any of the other Asian powers. You could add up all of the Asian powers together in their economic size, in their military power, and they wouldn't come close to the United States and China. So those two countries really have an enormous influence over the course of the region. That said, in order to conduct their affairs in the region and towards one another, they need to depend upon the cooperation to a certain extent, or at the very least the acquiescence of other major Asian powers to get their own policies done. This is very true for the United States. It is, if it wants to play a significant security role in the Western Pacific, in the face of China's growing military capabilities there, and particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan, it must rely upon Japan, and it would like to rely upon South Korea, the Philippines as well, if it could, in dealing with, say, a Chinese military action against Taiwan of some kind. So it is dependent. It's also dependent upon the Asian democracies to gain support for the idea of advancing Asian values and democratic values at the same time. And so there is a good deal of interdependence that goes on across the region. I don't think you would call it a fully, genuinely multipolar region, but I do think that middle powers in Asia have influence, and they have both potential latent influence and actual influence. Unfortunately, my view is that they're not really using that influence as effectively as they could and should. We've already had a sort of hints at that, a reference to that by some comments made by the others on the panel in the context of Southeast Asia. I often make the remark when I meet with Japanese and South Korean friends that they could do a lot more. They could stand up a lot more, speak out more in expressing their desires and their concerns about the nature of the Sino-US relationship and where it's going. I think Asian countries are indeed very concerned about this relationship, It's not simply a question of being concerned about one side's rise, China, or the other side's overreach in some ways, the US. It's about the dynamic between the two of them, something that concerns me very much. And I think Asian states really could play a much greater role in expressing their concerns and their cautions, their desire for some caution and greater specificity in some cases in the US-China relationship.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Henry, over to you, and let's pick up on what Michael just mentioned about rising tensions between the United States and China. On the current path that we're on right now, how likely is a direct clash between the United States and China in the next few years?
Well, I think that yeah, Michael is right. I think there's a lot of tension and this dynamic that really is constantly changing, deteriorating, should really be highly noted, not only by US and China, but also by countries in the region, like ASEAN countries and East Asian countries. So what I think now is that I hope this adjustment period, I call it, or this agonizing, difficult time that won't last very long. But I mean, let's say 10, 15 years probably. We'll finally get each other a customer and maybe get accepted by each other. I think what China rising in modern history of the mankind is probably a miracle of globalization. That with help of every country, but also with thousands of years of a culture and internal logic, of hardworking and education and meritocracy system and all the things has combined. So globalization combined with China's culture produced a really great miracle that we haven't seen, such as lift 800 million people out of poverty in decades, 70% reduction for the UN objective in a year. So I think that is really important that China-US relation we have to see in the long run. I was talking to Joseph Nye some time ago. He said maybe by 2035, and Graham Madison said there's this track, but also Kevin Roth said this is can be avoided, that we don't have to get into the war. So what I think it's whether we're going to have a direct conflict in the next 5-10 years, it largely depends on wisdom and on the sober minding of the leaders of all the countries involved. I would think it probably is a little difficult than used to be because we're now in the nuclear age, where we're now in a much intertwined world than the Soviet Union era, where there's no economic activities going on. We're now really depend on each other so much. So I think that certainly the countries will not pick sides. I mean, from what we've seen from ASEAN countries, even the East Asian countries, they don't like to pick sides. Second, I think it's really foolish for US to probably not wise to accelerate those decoupling like the semiconductor sector. That really, China is the largest market for semiconductor chips. Now it's going to be a huge loss for companies in Taiwan, in South Korea, in the US. I mean, the reason that the Taiwanese company and the South Korea company get so big is because they're close to China, they sell to China, they profit from China, they thrive in China. But now if they cut off that market, those semiconductor companies will really have a big problem ahead. So I don't know how long the business community can stand up for that, or the world economy can stand for that. We cannot go back to the primitive days. So what I think now is that we have to find a way to communicate. Let's face the common challenge of climate change and the pandemic and all the poverty and global south, and let's do more on that. So I would really think that the countries like Canada can play an enormous role, as it did in the past, to balance China-US relation. The Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was the first Western country, one of the first to recognize China. And also, actually, I was told that the Pierre Trudeau, when they established Canadian-China diplomatic ties, Canada was the first to icon the term one China policy, to invent the terms on that. So why not? The countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, all those countries, let's really have some, balancing on that, mediating on that. And also we could have a G3 concept, China, EU, and US, and EU could play some mediating role with other developing countries and developed countries. So I think, if we all work together with UN, with multilateral system, with WTO, with all those regional framework, we probably could see a war avoided, military hot war. But let's not really pursue too much of the Cold War and decoupling. That is really very dangerous for all of us.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for helping us unpack that. And since you just raised Canada, let me turn to Kai then, because we hear on the one hand that Canada needs to cooperate more with the United States in the region in order to increase our national profile there, right? We've been left out of AUKUS, for example. We're seeking to join the U.S. Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as we just heard. But at the same time, there are others who argue that Canada benefits from a rules-based and open economic order in the region, and that order might be damaged by zero-sum U.S.-China competition. So what, in fact, are Canada's interests in the region, and who are our key regional partners as a result?
Canada has a lot of interest in the region. Obviously, the economic relationship with the Asia-Pacific is immensely important to Canada. Canada benefits from stability politically, whether that's because of refugees, because of migration. There is clear anxiety on the part of Canadian leadership on being left out of AUKUS and the Quad. I don't know if that's warranted. Canada, I think, is strongest internationally when it plays its own role, when it defines its own role. And there is an appeal to being a proxy of sorts to the United States. The United States remains the world's largest military power, and being a satellite of sorts to that gives power by proximity. But it also limits Canada's ability to be an effective player in meaningful ways. I think Canada has learned domestically how to engage a diverse and nuanced population. And if it brings some of that to its diplomacy, it can play that role as a mediator, or at least contribute to the role of mediating and moderating great power conflict.
Gotcha. Thank you. And Elina, let's dig a little bit deeper on this topic in particular, because we often hear that many regional actors are wary of Chinese encroachment and they welcome greater security cooperation with the United States. But at the same time, we also hear that these same countries don't want to choose definitively between the U.S. and China, and they reject an ideological framing of democracy versus authoritarianism that divides the region in a binary fashion. So can you help us unpack all of that?
All of what you said is true. There are multiple challenges on the territorial front, for example, South China Sea being a prominent area of dispute right now. And so there are concerns about increasing Chinese assertiveness in those waters. But at the same time, the reality is that China is a good friend, a partner to many Southeast Asian countries, as is the US and other countries like Canada, European Union countries. And the motto, it's almost like fairies and rainbows, right? In Southeast Asia, the more the merrier. We want friendship with everyone. If only that could be the case. And this is where Southeast Asian countries feel squeezed. Even though major powers say, we're not the ones who are making you choose, we don't want you to choose, the reality is that those choices are being forced upon us with competing initiatives, whether they're economic or whether they're defense or security related. You mentioned AUKUS. And even though explanations are given, justifications are given, and Southeast Asian countries understand these strategic imperatives from a major power perspective, the reality is that smaller countries in the region still need to figure out how to navigate these challenges. And Zachary mentioned rules-based order. I think the assumption is that this rules-based order has worked for all countries in the world equally. And that's really not the case. Sure, countries have been pulled out of poverty and economic growth has happened, but the reality is that there is still a lot of inequity, inequality in major power relations with the rest of the world. I recently came across this term. We like to talk about the Global South. And the Global South is often seen as kind of marginalization of the major powers. But really, the Global South is the majority world. And if we turn that framing onto its head and really think about what the power of the majority world, those of us in Asia and Latin America and Africa, means for our agency and our autonomy in a more competitive geopolitical landscape, then maybe we can start to fashion our own futures in very different ways apart from the frameworks and the templates that we have right now. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm going to go around the horn one more time before we open up the floor to questions, and I'd like to dwell on the question of values and norms and principles in shaping regional order. because many scholars acknowledge that stable international orders rely not just on shared interests between different state actors, but also on a degree of shared identities and shared values as well, which to a significant extent is lacking in the region today, especially as it comes to U.S.-China relations. So, Michael, how will this political diversity in the region, as it were, affect prospects to construct a durable regional order that can survive a potential power transition between the United States and China?
Well, I think when you look at the issue of a durable regional order, you really have to ask, on what basis can you have a attitude or a set of policies by China and by the United States that are acceptable to both of them and that serve the interests of the region as a whole, but don't sacrifice at the same time the vital interests of either country or the region. And that is not something that you can get simply by trying to get everybody to be on the same page across the board in terms of values. You have to really say, what are the values in particular that are most important for the region and for the major powers in the region, and what among them are negotiable, what are non-negotiable, and what are mutually exclusive. Now, you can't say across the board that all the values and norms are shared by all the countries in the region, including China, the United States. There are certain norms, certain values that are not shared or not interpreted in the same way. The question is, do you let them get in the way of those areas where you need to have a common sense of norms and values? And I'll give you some examples. I think it's undeniable that there is a common norm across all Asian countries and across countries in the world to protect national security, national sovereignty. That national sovereignty is a vital issue. It's embedded in the UN Charter. It's what defines interstate relations. And so protecting that national sovereignty and defining it clearly, where are its limits, et cetera, is important and needs to be done. But you have a common basis for doing that. Secondly, you have a common basis for dealing with values of self-preservation and security that are threatened by certain transnational forces. Climate change, first and foremost. We're seeing the examples of climate change all over the world today in an increasingly serious manner. All countries have a vital stake in dealing with that. You can say it is an important norm to be able to have an effective climate management set of policies and strategy. I would say in many respects it overrides the more narrow individual state-centered national security priorities of the countries involved, because it really is an existential threat in many different ways. So there are shared norms, shared values that I think the region can identify and the region can begin discussing and define how to protect them and how to advance them. But if we emphasize that the values here are political values, they have to do with democracy as defined by liberal democratic nations versus non-democracies as seen in autocratic nations and one-party dictatorships like China, you're not going to get anywhere in terms of developing common norms for the region. You'll never be able to bridge that gap. And if you define the global order in those terms, democracy versus authoritarianism, as the Biden administration does, you're not going to be able to bridge those gaps. And you've got to be able to proceed on the basis of what norms do you share and what are your interests in cooperating to strengthen those shared norms. And I think there's a possibility for doing that in Asia. I don't think we have to assume that across the board, the norms and values of the Chinese and the United States are mutually exclusive. There are ways of reaching common ground here, but you've got to be able to suppress those different forces that really do kind of push towards an extreme totalistic definition of the norms value competition in a very, very zero-sum way. If you allow that to happen, then you're not going to deal with all these other common norms and values, which I think are essential to stabilizing the region over the long term.
Now, Henry, Western criticism of China on a wide variety of issues has certainly deepened in its intensity in recent years, and thus far Beijing's response or reaction appears to be quite defensive, and this may be understandable given that many of these issues touch on questions of what Beijing sees as its core interests or its national sovereignty. But nonetheless, this reactive wolf warrior diplomacy type response has not played very well in the West. So I'm wondering if China actually has a long-term strategy to deal with these values-related questions in its diplomatic outreach.
Yes, I think that actually this is a great question, and I think there are some norms and values. I mean, like Michael was saying. I mean, of course, sovereignty, territorial integrity, those post-war UN Charter principle has been recognized. I mean, China recognized that, many countries does, and so those are values. And also the other thing is the market forces. So the 20th Party Congress report said market will play a decisive role in the Chinese economy with the government help. So what I think is those economic law. I mean, those opening up, liberalization of trade, facilitating of investment, and education, competitive advantage, all those things. I mean, are common values. China benefits from that. Open up and welcome foreign investment. So those are, I think, the values that we all cherish. As far as democracy and meritocracy is concerned, I agree with Mike. I mean, you can't use that as a benchmark to say which is good, which is bad. We see democracy facing a lot of challenges worldwide. I mean, we see UN just change, 5 times the prime minister change hands, and then we see, Europe countries also facing a lot of challenges for that model. I mean, US is too. So, but then you look at China. China has a whole people process democracy, consultative democracy, and then meritocracy. I mean, all the officials, you have to be taking exams in order to be promoted. That's an election selection as well. I mean, you have to go through all the layers before you become a top leader. So you see, the system, whether the Chinese democracy works or Western democracy works, let's measure, like Deng Xiaoping said, black, white cat, let's catch its mice. If China can lift 800 million people out of poverty, making China 4 decades into the 2nd largest economy, and also infrastructure-wise is the best now in the world, you can see the way the system not working in China. It works fine. Probably, I think what I would say, there's a lot of cultural differences, like Oriental culture, Confucius society attaches a lot on family values, people's relations, also the, respect authorities, and of course, attaches greatly on talent development, and also collectivism, whereas Western practice more individualism. So those kind of cultural differences, we should not, totally say which is bad, which is good. Let's really see how it works in China, because China, after all, 5,000 years, is always a continental country, whereas US is a maritime country. So we do have a lot of differences in terms of culture, history, heritage. So let's not really, throw the baby out, bathwater out with the babies. Let's really find the right rationale behind every system, but then peacefully compete that like we do for Olympics. So if it works for China, like we just, CPC party report just summarized, China now built the largest education system, largest health care system, and largest social security system in the world now. So you can imagine, China made a lot of progress. So I would not really think we have a lot of value differences. After all, we're all human beings, we're all global villagers. So I think we can really talk to each other, work with each other, but it takes time. I'm sure it takes time. It will take 10, 20 years before we settle down and recognize each other. I agree with Mike. We are facing much imminent common challenges like climate change. It's real. It's not a fiction. It's real. And pandemic, we're still haven't got all the woods on that. And of course, all the other global South challenges as well. So I would think that let's set aside the geopolitical differences, political differences, or values, so-called value differences. Let's concentrate on the similarities: openness, free trade, and globalization inclusive, and also helping your people, the middle class. Let's create a bigger middle class. That's the most important job for China now. So I think we have a lot of things to learn. I was talking to a number of Nordic countries that they say they have a good welfare system and socialist system. China can learn from that. So let's really work on it. Canada is a good example. Why Canada can have a universal health care system where U.S. does not? So China could learn from Canada too. So I would think, we have a lot of merits of each other, but not really simplify that as autocracy versus democracy. China has its own democracy system, but let's all improve on that. So nobody's perfect, but I would think let's measure on the performance. That's the bottom line.
Henry, how much of a meritocracy is China still, in your view, following the 20th Communist Party of China Congress that just took place? It looks like there was a clean sweep for Xi Jinping on the Politburo, and the man who is likely to be the next premier of China has no national governing experience. China appears to be moving towards less openness. Is that meritocratic model in jeopardy, in your view?
No, I don't think. Actually, I think the continuity will be there. President Xi already in charge for 10 years, and that all the things has been quite consolidated in terms of the big direction. Like another centennial goal is set it up. I think every country probably has the same. If you have a new leadership come out, he'll have his own cabinet, he'll pick his own people. I think the official promoted this time is better than just if you make a great speech or great campaign, you be elected in the Western society. It's probably quite different. Even talk about this number 2 Politburo Standing Committee member Li Qiang. He worked in Wenzhou. He's really from grassroots, with all the private sectors. And then he worked in Zhejiang province, where he probably cultivated Alibaba, the largest free enterprise in China and one of in the world. And then when he was also governor of party secretary of Jiangsu province, the most developed area in China. He was in Shanghai. He imported the Tesla, now the biggest clean vehicle producer in the world now. So if he's probably coming to the federal government, I think federal government, there are already many committees, I think, coordinating. He just have to bring in his really good experience on how to motivate the private sector, how to motivate welcome in multinationals. He probably will be doing fine. So I don't think we have to use all the measurement to measure the new leadership. I think the new leadership probably more united, will be more concentrated, more efficient, more effective. That may not be a bad news for China. So let's see. I mean, we certainly see this new composition has a lot of coast province experience, developed area experience in China. That may be a blessing for the China to upgrade for its still 1 billion, not become a middle class. Those developed area already become middle class. That's why they all got promoted. But I think 1 billion still, we want to make another $500 million or even 1 billion into middle class in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So their experience of developed area is very valuable in China for this current leadership.
Okay, thanks very much for providing your perspective. I'd like to ask our audience members who would like to ask a question to begin lining up at one of our 2 microphones while I ask a couple more questions of Elina and Kai. Elina, over to you. ASEAN member states are themselves quite diverse. You've got authoritarian states and democratic states. You've got some countries that are friendlier with China and others that are perhaps less well disposed to good relations with China. You've got literal countries in the South China Sea and non-literal countries. You've got Muslim countries, Christian countries, Buddhist countries. And despite that, they've been able to forge a compact that limits conflict between them. So is that a model that can serve the wider region as well?
Not very easily, right? That compact has been forged, and we continue to see challenges, particularly with what's going on in Myanmar right now. And so it's been an effort, and I don't think any Southeast Asian country would say, hey, look at us, we're a model for integration, for good relations. We continue to work on ourselves in the region. There's a lot of self-criticism, a lot of self-doubt as well. There's a lot of talk about the benefit and value of minilateralism over getting everybody on board in a usual ASEAN way with consensus formation. But I think at the end of the day, what is crucial for ASEAN is to preserve its diversity in all those different forms, but find a way to also speak with one voice, particularly at regional and international forums and discussions, as norms are being formed in many different areas, including in the technological space, where I think there's going to be a new battle for governance frameworks, how those frameworks are going to be set up, established. You see this already with competing initiatives between the US and China at the policy level, but also at the technical level. There hasn't been enough representation among Southeast Asians at these various tech forums, whether again at the policy, legal, or technical levels. And there needs to be that foresight, because I think very often ASEAN countries are caught up in the moment. We're trying to grapple with geopolitical competition with our large neighbors. We're not thinking far enough. We're not thinking about the order that is going to be imposed on us in a way that we accept as being a part of the system. Really, we should be trying to help forge that system in a way that works for us, not just now, but in the future.
Last question for Kai before we open the floor. Many critics of Canadian foreign policy, Kai, have highlighted that a values-centric approach or megaphone diplomacy has only often served to isolate Ottawa on the world stage, and we've seen examples of this before. In your view, how much do values need to be at the core of Canada's regional engagement in Asia?
That's a good question, and I think that criticism is valid. Canada has been called out, I think rightfully, for the mismatch between its rhetoric on some fronts and its presence in the region. I think it's important to point out that Asia today is a different place than it was 25, 30 years ago, right? The West and the appeal of Western ideas is not what it once was. The Trump administration has tarnished that even further. There's a lot of awareness of the challenges that North America and Europe have faced socially, politically, economically, and as has been pointed out, there are alternative models in East Asia that some in Southeast Asia look towards and recognize as successful in things that are valued, development, improving livelihoods. I think Canada has a lot of work to do to reconcile the principle-based foreign policy with reality on the ground. I think these two things aren't incompatible. It's entirely possible to have a principle-based foreign policy that works, and something like inclusive development, I think, is well received. There is very little pushback against the notion that development should include gender, should include different regions within Asia. So that's not the problem. I think where Canada has gotten itself into trouble with this values-based diplomacy is what's seen as, again, this mismatch between very strong rhetoric on one hand, but on the other hand, a very limited presence on the ground. For this type of diplomacy to be successful, Canada has to be more present in the region. It has to be more committed in the region. It has to invest in the region in a meaningful way. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge underlying the Indo-Pacific strategy. Again, as I started at the open, the logic is clear. The importance of shifting focus to Asia is uncontested. But the hard work to be done is in where those trade-offs occur, and in doing all of the legwork on the ground and showing up consistently and being a reliable partner. That's critical for success, and it remains to be seen whether Canada will do that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Kai. We do have a question from the floor. Please introduce yourself and make it clear to whom you are posing your question.
Sure, thank you. My name is David Storman. I work for the Global Affairs Canada. I'm in the China Bureau division. This is really for the panel. It's a question about the architecture. I'm wondering, this has been hinted at, but if we see our neighbors, the US, go off a cliff politically, or with domestic turmoil, or just an isolationist theme, how would that affect the architecture? And I ask that in the context of mid-century, with the consolidation of Xi Jinping's rule, the rise of Trump and Brexit, we saw China really become much more assertive multilaterally, for better or for worse. If the US suddenly, as I say, dropped off a cliff, how would that affect everything? And that's to the whole panel, please.
And thanks very much. Okay, let's start with Michael maybe on that one.
I guess the first question you have to ask is, what does dropping off the cliff mean? If that means that the United States stops being engaged in Asia, that it decides that it's just too costly and not sufficiently supportive of its interests, and it reduces its commitments on the security side, it reduces its economic presence, et cetera, what will that do? If that's your definition of it, then I think that in many ways you'll have an Asia that, now I'm very critical of the US position in Asia from certain vantage points, and so this is not an unqualified statement, but I think if you had that, a lot of what would happen in Asia here would become a much more uncertain region. It would become a much less stable region. There would be a greater tendency to balance bilaterally within the region with efforts to plow more resources into defense and military instruments than otherwise. And it would lose a lot of its economic dynamism if the United States really were to sort of withdraw and fall off the cliff. Now, another way that you can say the United States might fall off the cliff is if it becomes incredibly aggressive towards China. In other words, the opposite of withdrawing from Asia, it doubles down in a very, very confrontational way. And the way in which that would likely produce the most serious fallback would be regarding Taiwan. If the United States, in the context of a worsening Sino-US competition strategically, were to decide that Taiwan now really should become a de facto strategic ally of the United States, brought within the US defense perimeter, a policy of strategic clarity established vis-a-vis the defense of Taiwan, doubling down on military, not just arms sales, but military presence and support for Taiwan, then in my view, we would be very much closer to conflict in the region. That kind of a no holds barred, zero sum, worst case assessment by the US of the Taiwan issue that would require, that in the US view requires Taiwan to become a strategic ally, that will almost guarantee a conflict with the Chinese. So that would be, of course, disastrous for the region, for the US, for China, for Taiwan. So you have two different extreme alternatives. I don't think the former one is at all likely. The US is not about to withdraw from the region. I am concerned that a version of the latter could very well emerge, particularly under a Republican president and under a much more hawkish Congress and in the context of a worsening Sino-US rivalry. My greatest concern is that the Taiwan issue will become unmanageable. And that is a consequence that no one in the region should be supporting.
View from the region. Elina, your thoughts?
So I think Michael has brought up a very important point. How do you view this? And for me personally, I think the US has been perilously close to the edge of the cliff a number of times. And we often look at state level analysis because we are interested in geopolitics, but the biggest marker for me has been in the domestic relations of the US amongst its different communities. And that was always the case. Trump simply brought to surface what was always there. And so many people, including in the US, were just stunned by that. But that domestic dynamic also translated to its foreign policy. And I don't think anyone outside the United States, or even in the United States, should be surprised if that happens again in a few days with the elections, but also in about 2 years. So if that happens, I think we outside the United States need to be better prepared for that, because we've had a preview of what it could be with the Trump administration. And so there's no reason for us to expect a continued US foreign policy along the trajectory that we've come to expect pre-Trump. So if we don't prepare for it, then really the blame should be on us.
Kai, if we have a Republican in the White House after 2024, does Canada have to rethink the nature of its regional engagement and cooperation with the US in the region?
Well, I'm heartened that the question came from someone at Global Affairs Canada. It suggests that this is being taken seriously. Look, I think the Trump administration a couple of years ago accelerated what was probably a necessary shift anyway. It is important for Canada to think of its place in the world independent of the United States. And I think with a major shift in foreign policy, that is the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's important to have all contingencies on the table. And it is the case that political instability in the United States is likely to continue. That's likely to have foreign policy implications, at least on one level. And again, that's what drove the imperative for diversification a number of years ago. That was primarily economic because of the economic tensions under the trade administration, but that has lots of ramifications that go beyond economics as well. And this has been pointed out, for Canada to play the mediating role that it might, for it to reclaim its place in the global order as a middle power that has the capacity to leverage goodwill and the relatively positive perception of Canada, it has to have a degree of independence, or at least be seen as having a degree of independence from the US.
Henry, Michael raised the unlikely prospect that the United States could become perhaps less involved in the region in a security capacity. I'm wondering, does China view some form within limits of U.S. security engagement in the region as a force for stability? Is that something that China generally welcomes?
Well, I think, since the Second World War, I mean, the Bretton Woods system that U.S. helped to establish has really keep the world running for over 7 decades, but that system needs to be upgraded and enhanced. What I really think, our audience raised a great question, whether U.S. is falling out of a cliff in its impact to the world. I really think that the U.S. probably could do a bit better domestically. I think domestically probably is falling off the cliff now. For example, we have a larger deficit, larger than the GDP of the U.S. We have a life expectancy being shortened quite a bit these 3 years. We have a middle class, stagnating for the last 7 decades. From zero, the middle class is not really expanding; it's shrinking probably. And then China become a scapegoat for many of those domestic issues, because that's a virtuous cycle now. If any politician running for the office not bashing or attacking China, he will not get elected. But I think that's not, China is not the root of the problem. Every country should really look at its own problem. So the U.S. domestic policy, how to improve its domestic, improvement of the middle class, and let's not have 1% of the population equal to the 40-50% of the population of its wealth. Let's really avoid that. That's like, China has realized that problem. First, lift 800 million people out of poverty. Now they're calling for common prosperity. Basically means we have another 300 million migrant workers in the center, in the city. We need to upgrade them into middle class. And then after 400 million middle class, let's have, what about the other 1 billion left? We should improve on that. So trying to avoid those deglobalization things. So what I think, the world situation can get very dangerous, and the regional can be very dangerous. But let's, sort it out the domestic issue first, and really let that in harmony. Otherwise, all those excuses of foreign countries and other countries will always be. Of course, China has a lot of needs to be improved as well. But China is not the root of the problem of everything that U.S. has. So, but if this political dynamic is now changing every time when there's a election going on or campaign season, China is always on top of the issue. I think that's really weird. I mean, we have to change that. I mean, same thing for China too. I mean, we should contain the nationalism, populism. Let's really work on the harmony and fighting the common threat. So I agree with Mike. We should really avoid this Taiwan issue. It's a domestic issue, and it's the China established diplomatic ties with 181 countries that one China policy, and the U.S. should not send its highest official to visit there and to really provoke China. So let's really think rationally, and let's really think about how we can really commonly. I mean, U.S. has always demonstrated great leadership. We hope that China can add on, and we can really get a word out of this challenging time for many years to come.
Thanks very much, Henry. We've got another question from the floor over here. Please line up at a microphone if you'd like to ask a question as well. We've got 10 minutes left officially on the program, but I've been given permission to extend that by a few minutes as we have quite a long break afterwards. So please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew Erskine, researcher for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. My question is particularly for Michael. I just want to kind of get your insight as to what you think is guiding Sino-US tensions over the Indo-Pacific's architecture. Particularly, is it ideological in terms of a democratic versus autocratic notions of geoeconomics or geosecurity? Or is it more hegemonic, where we have two competing notions of what being a hegemon means and how that can equate to influencing the region's architecture? And does one or the other, or do both in that situation, create more room for miscalculations that could lead to a possible armed confrontation between the two parties?
Well, I think the greatest problem in developing a coherent, genuinely region-wide architecture is national interest and ideology. You have two great powers that are competing over the same space. Both of them regard that space as absolutely critical to their interests. And they want to have a preponderance of influence in defining that space and the way in which it's going to function over time. The United States sees itself as being in general, the kind of guarantor of order and security in the region, has played that role for many, many decades, particularly, primarily in maritime Asia, not on the continent. And it sees that threatened. And so it's trying to strengthen the region's awareness and its concern over China's role in the region. And the Chinese are not doing much different. They're also seeing the region as one in which the United States has an inordinate amount of control and influence over. And so they're trying to alter the structure of the region, the nature of it, so that it better suits Chinese interests. So it is, to some significant extent, a kind of zero-sum rivalry over the region, but it doesn't need to be, the outcome does not need to be a zero-sum, mutually exclusive outcome. If the two sides recognize that they're both contributing to it and that they both have to modify their positions to some significant degree to reach some kind of mutual accommodation in certain areas. Certain areas are going to have to stay the way they are without much in the way of mutual accommodation, but you want to be able to buffer and manage them. And I think if you define the region as being one that needs to adhere to your set of principles as defined by you, then you're in trouble. And I think the United States has been the clearest in trying to do that. But I don't think China is completely immune from that effort either. China, in general, I think, wants to make the region safe for its form of government. That means nobody's going to seriously challenge it, and nobody will seriously challenge China's most vital interests in the region. So what we have to do is we have to be able to define or redefine what regional order means for a contentious U.S.-China relationship in this complex region, this complex essential region. And there, I don't think it can happen simply through Sino-U.S. interaction. You may be able to get partly the way there, not under the current leadership in either country, in my view. It's not going to happen under a Biden administration, and I doubt it will happen under a Xi Jinping government either. But that points again to the importance of other powers, other regional powers, middle powers, Japan first and foremost, followed by South Korea and the Southeast Asian nations, to really try to better coordinate their definition of what the region should look like, their definition of where they want to see the Sino-US relationship over time and what it takes to get there. And I think that, there's just not enough being done. The close US allies are too deferential. They don't want to jeopardize the kind of relationship that they've had with the United States, and they don't want to antagonize the Chinese. So they opt out on a sort of the default position is to be somewhat passive. And I think that that is no longer a viable strategy for the other major Asian powers. They have to become more vocal and they have to become more insistent in some ways without being dogmatic about the need to have a regional order that does reflect these kind of middle ground understandings between the US and China.
Okay, one more question from the floor over here.
Thank you, Michael. My question relates to the ongoing
And please
efficacy.
introduce yourself.
Yes,
please.
I apologize. Jim Boutillier. My question relates to the ongoing efficacy of ASEAN, and it's directed to Elina at the head table. It strikes me that increasingly, as a result of Chinese foreign policy and investment, that at least two of the member states of ASEAN, Cambodia and Laos, are being slowly and steadily reduced to the status of Chinese satrapies, and there may be one or two other candidates. This, of course, strikes at the very heart of the animating philosophy of ASEAN, its consensus-driven decision-making. And I'd be interested in your observations about the ongoing vitality of ASEAN as a regional organization in view of Chinese overtures into its realm. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Always expect tough questions from you. So I think one way to look at this is that regardless of what the perceptions are with regards to Cambodia and Laos, both countries have, in my personal opinion, been given short shrift, particularly from outside ASEAN, but also from within ASEAN. And that's why you hear increasing calls for minilateralism within ASEAN and Southeast Asia in general. This is unfortunate because it took a lot for these newer members of ASEAN to be a part of the ASEAN family. And now there are calls to almost entrench that hierarchy of membership within the group. Cambodia, as ASEAN chair, I think, has really gone to great lengths. Some may not agree with me, but I feel in this chairmanship year, Cambodia has been a lot more active, if not proactive, even on the Myanmar issue, which a lot of ASEAN member states had not expected of Cambodia. And I think that has been very deliberate because Cambodia has been eager to prove that it has advanced beyond the debacle of its chairmanship 10 years ago. And that has not been adequately recognized from within Southeast Asia, let alone outside Southeast Asia. And as for whether they appear satellite states of China or not, I think the other part of the equation is we have two treaty allies of the United States in ASEAN. And that has rarely been questioned, if at all. It's just been accepted as a fact. And if countries are growing closer to whether it's China or India or whichever other power in ASEAN, as long as that doesn't threaten, and I recognize this is a potential problem in ASEAN now, it doesn't threaten the stability of ASEAN as a grouping, then that shouldn't be an issue. And I just mentioned a second ago, I recognize that that's not being questioned. And this is why there's a lot of hand-wringing within ASEAN now as to what the different influences of particularly China and the US have on Southeast Asia as one coherent unit.
Paul Evans.
Thank you. Paul Evans from the University of British Columbia. And my question is for Henry Wang. And Henry, thank you so much for being with us today. Your voice makes an important difference in how we think about the affairs that are on our agenda today. So welcome. But I want to challenge you on the proposition of globalization with 21st century characteristics, and to suggest that the world that you paint, the aspirations that you paint for globalization may be yesterday's story. We see a world of bifurcation, American policy in a variety of areas and that of other countries, occasionally my own, are leaning towards a new kind of world order that is not based on that what is seen as hyper-globalization of past. This is a bifurcated world. Semiconductors as just one example of that bifurcation. Please give us grounds for optimism that kind of globalization and what could come with it in a security order is not yesterday's news. How can you encourage us in this matter?
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul, for your kind comment. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your question. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, it's the world is still very challenging, and it's not a linear and straightforward path for all the nations. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, given I lived through China. I mean, I'm old enough to go through the Cultural Revolution, and I know what has changed in China. And so with I also see the boom of Asia and ASEAN, and I'm very grateful to Canada, where I studied for many years and worked there many years. So I see the world really, a human being fundamentally, the nature are the same. We have to be encouraged and lifted in a good spirit, rather than we are suspicious, like the pandemic. We've been cutting off for 3 years with no communication or visits. That's really bad, and deepened the suspicion and even the mistrust. So what I would think is that we are certainly from the former Cold War Soviet Union era. I think that the business community, in the end, will not tolerate that. I mean, we see that even Germany wants to decouple. Chancellor Scholz now actually is going to be in Beijing, and with quite a big delegation of business. We see that BASF has invested 10 billion euro in Guangdong, and BMW, Volkswagen, and all those companies. Merck are also heavy investment in China again. So even though during the pandemic, China's trade last year has gone up 30% worldwide. So I think also China-Canada has a huge good relation in the long term. So I think there's still optimism. China now sends about still 700,000 students annually around the world. There's about 2 million Chinese students or graduates working in the United States. That means 2 million families in China, could be 20 million people affected in the elite part of China. And China also, after the pandemic, China could rebound its tourism. There's already 10 million people went to Japan before pandemic, and 10 million went to Thailand. Altogether, 150 million people touring around the world, spent $200 billion US. So I'm thinking that the economic law, that there's market forces, as long as China still recognizes principles, and U.S. is the champion of free enterprises. We see those stories still happening, and now we are also facing such much larger challenges from the nature, from climate change, from pandemic. I see no reason we can't really work together. And also, we are living in a nuclear age. I mean, if anything accidental happened, we could destroy each other many times over. So I think I still cautious and optimistic with the economic prosperity we're having unprecedented, before the last century, and so we probably also in China, all the child is currently young people, one-child family. Nobody wants to fight a war. so China is aging too. The shortage of young people now. So I think, in the end, if we can have all those economic rationing prevail, and if we can, and that's why I agree with Michael that all those medium powers, like Canada, like EU, like Australia and Japan, can really come up now and look, the big guys don't fight, and let's calm down, let's talk, and like Ottawa 20 and WTO issue would be great examples of that. So I really hope that countries like Canada, knowing the country so well on East and West, with 1 million diaspora Chinese living in Canada, could play a huge role in making peace and making the future more secure. I'm really very hopeful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Jeff.
Thank you very much. Jeff Nankabel, still with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I'd like to thank the panelists for participating, and I'm going to take the opportunity to keep Mr. Wang on the hot seat And my question is this, and I'm interested in the views of the other panelists as well, but maybe first to you, Mr. Wang, is China historically, the government of China in its diplomacy and its rhetoric has put such a strong emphasis on the inviolability of territorial integrity. And yet we have seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, initially kind of a tacit support, and it seems now a growingly visible moral support, diplomatic support by China for Russia in the face of the facts on the ground of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And my question is, what kind of rationale can be used to justify such a position on the part of China? And for those in the region, what does such a stance on such a blatant violation of territorial integrity by Russia, what does such a stance by China with its 14 neighbors mean for peace and security in the region? And how can we really be talking about advancing peace and security when we have such a blatant threat to the international order and the United Nations system and its principles staring us in the face, and we have players in the region, including China, who are providing diplomatic and moral support for this? Thank you.
So, Henry, are China's strategic partnership with Russia and its support for the principles of the UN Charter fundamentally incompatible?
Yeah. Thank you, Riff, for that question. Well, I don't think China has a strategic partnership with Russia. I mean, there was a February 4th statement, but that was under the condition that President Biden had a virtual summit with President Xi and said 4 no's and all those great words. But the moment he went back, he said he's going to boycott Beijing Olympic. That's really a big slap on the face of China. And then President Putin comes out and said, "Look, I'm coming. I'm going to support you 100% for the Beijing Olympic. You have done 7 years of preparation." So there is some reciprocal, I think, response from China on that February 4th statement. But China say that friendship is unlimited. There's no limit. That kind of statement, very often doesn't mean China was aware or conspired with the Russian invasion. I mean, China citizen was the last to pull out the key. Quite a few almost get killed. Is evidence of China doesn't really know that Russia is launching a war against that. But even after war broke out, China has said, the Foreign Minister Wang said at the Munich Security Conference that Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty it has to be respected. China said that again when Foreign Minister Wang met Ukraine Foreign Minister at the UN, that this is again, sovereignty of Ukraine has to be respected. UN Charter has to be respected. Of course, China also said, we need to probably consider some balanced security. Not every country's security concern should be addressed. So that is a little different. But then again, finally, China would like to promote a peace and mediate. That's why I wrote an op at the New York Times that China can really come much more forward to help on mediating if necessary, if needed. But again, you can see President Putin is not happy with that. I mean, at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, President Putin said on the camera, look, I know China only have a balanced position. You have a lot of concerns and problems. Let me explain to you, President Xi, in private. So you can see China's position is not that same as in Russia. The only thing I think China quite different with US and the Western world is China not favoring sanctions, because China is the largest trading nation with 130 countries. China doesn't want to have energy crisis. 72% of the China petroleum depends on the import. If the energy prices goes up, it costs China trillions. So China is not really favoring any sanctions, and same as India, and 2/3 of the countries in the world doesn't favor sanctions to some extent. So I would say that China is not exactly same as US, but not as people thought China is really on the Russian side, 100%. China haven't sold any troops. China sold any trade. The defense minister of China said at the Shangri-La dialogue, China does not provide any substantial military or material support. I know Russia is hungry for basic chips and those low-grade chips China can easily provide. China does not. Many SOE do not really do business in Russia these days from China. So So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding probably, but again, I agree that China wants to see a peaceful end, maybe wants to have more balanced security rather than one-sided. That's the only difference, I think. But Ukraine's position is highly respected, and that is a really official position of China.
We've only got about 5 minutes left, so if you could just direct your question to one or two members of the panel at most, if that's all right.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Hannibal El-Motar. I'm a lawyer at Macmillan down the street in Ottawa. I was a lawyer in China as well and recently returned from Beijing, and so I have some insights that might interest you. But first, I'll start with a question, which is, how badly do you think things will get before they get better? And this is for everyone except Henry. And Henry, we've heard a lot from you. I think I agree to a large extent, but I'm finding it difficult to see your description of things as anything other than a dream. And I think the China dream is definitely core policy today. But that said, I think the only thing that it has in common with the American dream is that they no longer apply to foreigners. I mean, you mentioned there's a lot of travel rebound in China, but that's for Chinese, it's not for foreigners. Foreigners still can't get in. And I think the US dream as well is more and more centered on Americans as opposed to foreigners. So I'm wondering, for moving away from this world of increasingly two solitudes, I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel, how badly will things get before they get better? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me direct that question to Elina and to Kai, and then I'll have one final question for Michael. And Michael, you can address both questions at the same time. I'll give you the last word. So Elina, go ahead.
It's a scary prospect. I think many of us in Southeast Asia are trying not to conceive of, but it's getting more and more inevitable, I think, given current trends. I don't know is my short answer, but I think the signs of being squeezed in Southeast Asia are already there. We see that on the economic front, we see that on the tech front. And even though, we in Southeast Asia, we have our own dream as well, and that is of interoperability and connectivity. You hear these phrases over and over again in policy documents. But those, the realization of those concepts is becoming a little more challenging because of the two solitudes that are being formed as you conceived of them. So I don't have a concrete answer for you. I think one way that we in Southeast Asia need to prepare for this is to perhaps do a better job of realizing our own agency, and that starts with being more present at discussion in international forum, not just listening, but also contributing our own insights, perspectives, and what we want of our future, which starts, to a sense, with understanding what it is that we really want, as opposed to just adapting and adapting models that are already existing, that work to a certain extent, but not perfectly in our context.
Kai.
Thanks. Canada is similar in that it has experience sleeping next to a giant that occasionally wakes up in a very grumpy mood. I think the glimpses of a dystopian future in which there is fundamental, both either domestic or international conflict, are enough to frighten Canadians as they are Southeast Asians into thinking critically about things like climate change, about things like political stability, and hopefully springing them into action. I mean, I have no concrete answer either in terms of how bad things can get, but certainly, if some of these glimpses are amplified and play out on a much larger scale, that's a terrifying prospect.
Michael, last word to you. I'd like to raise some figures that were recently published in a report written by the Center for the Future of Democracy at the University of Cambridge. And they say that in Western liberal democracies, which represent 1.2 billion people, 75% of the populations now hold a negative view of China, whereas in the rest of the world, which accounts for 6.3 billion people, 70% feel positively towards China, and in those countries, China has for the first time even overtaken the United States in terms of positive perceptions. So my question to you is, if, as a result of current geopolitical developments, the United States returns as, or preserves its position, consolidates its position as the dominant power in the Euro-Atlantic theater as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the strengthening of NATO, and if the United States wins the competition for shaping regional order in the security sense and maybe even in the economic and normative senses as well in the so-called Indo-Pacific region, but nonetheless it loses the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. Is that a net win for the United States, or is that a net loss over the long term for the United States?
Well, it's an excellent question. I'm a little leery about making generalizations about huge swaths of billions of people. But I think it is probably, for a lot of reasons, and not just because of the sentiments of the global South, could well be a loss for the United States and others if the United States is in some sense able to succeed as reestablishing itself as the clearly dominant power in both Europe and Asia, because that would require, I think, a kind of conflict and confrontation with China and possibly with Russia that would be, disastrous. I don't see the United States in a quote unquote winning in a clear-cut sense, a competition with China in Asia. Certainly not if it's involving military instruments by both sides. It'll be disastrous. And I think the global South is an important kind of corrective to a lot of the thinking that goes on in the West about international opinion towards China, towards the United States. It is a much more diverse globe, much more diverse planet with a lot of different views and measurements and standards for measuring what is good and bad about China and the United States. I think the United States is insufficiently sensitive to this. I think China is also somewhat insensitive to this. So I think both could learn some lessons from understanding the huge gaps that exist between Western and global South views on many of these great power issues, and adjust their policies accordingly. China is not going to run the table and dominate the world by having the global South more sympathetic with it than, say, Europe and many democratic states in Asia. Europe, democratic states in Asia, and the United States have the vast preponderance of economic power and influence in the world. And so China is not going to be able to fashion a successful global policy by simply aligning with, even though the numbers are very high, with sympathetic groups in the global South. It's going to have to come to terms with the West. And the West is going to have to do the same thing with China, because China itself, aside from the global South, but augmented by global South attitudes in many cases, China is a force to be reckoned with. It can't be contained, and it can't be overthrown or undermined in any fundamental way without jeopardizing war. So there, I think, I guess that's my overly complicated answer.
Well, it's a very sobering and thought-provoking point on which to conclude the discussion. On behalf of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and our partners at the Asia-Pacific Foundation, allow me to thank all four of you. I think that you have all demonstrated the tremendous value of having different perspectives from across the region come together, and I'm sure that I speak on behalf of everyone in this room in saying that we've all emerged wiser thanks to your comments today. So please, everyone here, join me in thanking our panelists. We will resume with our next session, I believe, at 11:30. Is that correct? In an hour, excuse me. Enjoy your
Thank you, Zachary. Thanks for your efforts, Zachary.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
you.